While many of us know what lie detectors are, have we ever considered that they can't actually detect lies? Hi, my name is Sahana Venkatesh, and in this speech, I will be covering on what polygraph detectors are and how they work. Polygraph testing, or more commonly known, lie detectors, are tests that scientific tools that are designed by humans to measure a person's physiological responses when being questioned, innately to determine whether or not they may be lying. Now, we've all seen the multiple movies where lie detectors are immediately able to detect whether or not someone is telling the truth or lying. But real life polygraph tests are a lot more complex. The goal of this presentation is to explore just exactly that, covering the four main points of the origins of polygraph testing, how they function, their modern uses, and finally, the controversies surrounding them. Let's get started with the origins. Now, the concept of lie detection actually came a long time before any polygraph was actually created. Early psychologists found a correlation between psychological emotions like fear and anxiety and physiological responses. In fact, John O'Connor from the Smithsonian Institute actually supports this by saying that criminologists also found this correlation and saw that elevated breathing levels may be correlated with stress and anxiety. This is only furthered by when polygraph tests were actually created, the first one being in the early 1920s. In 1921, William Alston Arstow created the first polygraph test. He's also notably the creator of Wonder Woman, but he actually created the first polygraph test through a systolic blood pressure system to analyze blood pressure spikes and see how that might correlate to a lie. John Augustus Larson created the polygraph test we know as today, using multiple senses to analyze whether or not someone may be lying. In his case, he used both blood pressure and breathing levels. This is further supported by the Supreme Court History Society, which said that these early polygraphs were actually the first instances of combining psychology with policing, and that these early polygraphs were initially determined to create a more scientific reform and encourage reduced force confessions. Ultimately, while the origins of polygraph testing are often seen as a weapon of intimidation, they're actually just created to be a more objective truth-seeking tool. This is also reflected in how they function. While polygraphs are often nicknamed lie detectors, they can't actually detect any lies. What they do instead is measure physiological responses, specifically breathing levels, heart rate, blood pressure, and skin conductivity, or sweat. In fact, the American Psychological Association determined that the entire concept of polygraphs really were based on the assumption that people experience higher levels of stress and anxiety when telling a lie than when telling a truth. This is furthered by how they actually work. Sensors are placed all around the body to measure these bodily functions, and then are recording whether or not they spike or whether or not there are sudden changes. These sudden changes may indicate that someone is lying, since people often experience a brief panic when decepting others. However, a lot of other emotions can cause spikes in these bodily functions, such as fear, embarrassment, confusion, or even just the nervousness at the being tested. So the entire process is quite subjective. However, nevertheless, these metrics are recorded on a chart, and the examiner is actually the one who interprets them. Many of us believe in the movie screen where the polygraph just detects whether or not it's lie or truth, but the examiner is actually the one who really determines whether or not someone is lying. This furthers the subjectivity of it all and correlates to how they're used today. Today, polygraphs are used in both investigative and security contexts, but not in courtrooms. This is widely because of how controversial they are. The U.S. Department of Justice cites that the FBI, CIA, and Department of Homeland Security all use polygraphs, but for national clearance security purposes. In fact, also the National Defense Department also uses these polygraph tests in order to deal with classified information. They are also used in criminal justice investigations, though not in the way you might think. While most of us may think that they are the single-handedly determinant in closing a case, they're actually used in the earlier stages of the process, like when gathering leads or narrowing down suspects. In fact, the National Criminal Justice Service reform says that even the FBI only sees polygraph tools as an investigative tool and not as the single-handedly determinant force in closing a case. This means that there are a lot of other tools that FBI and CIA and police are using, and not just the polygraph test. Furthermore, historically, these polygraph tests have also been used in the hiring process, especially for private firms. However, the Employee Polygraph Protection Act of 1988 has definitely regulated this a lot more, which means only specialized fields can use it, like pharmaceutical security. Ultimately, the uses of the polygraph today are definitely reflective in how their accuracy is questioned, getting into all the controversies that surround it. A polygraph's accuracy is definitely something that's been debated for decades upon decades. Some argue that the level of a polygraph test is ultimately determined by an examiner, and that you can reach high accuracies of it with someone who's trained. Since the examiner is the one who interprets this, the polygraph, this all makes perfect sense. However, others argue that the issues lie within the test itself, since the test really only measures physiological responses, correlating more to anxiety than actual lying. This creates a lot of debate. To solve this, the National Academy of Sciences in 2003 conducted possibly the largest study on polygraph testing that has ever occurred. In it, they determined that polygraph testing was far from accurate and definitely vulnerable to countermeasures. For example, they experienced a lot of false positives, especially with high-stakes environments, which makes sense since a lot of people experience a lot of higher and more radical emotions in high-stakes environments. Legal authorities have also questioned its accuracy. The American Bar Association states that most U.S. courts take polygraph testing with a huge grain of salt and only in supplement with other materials, and some U.S. courts don't take it at all. Journalists have also investigated this, with the Washington Post discussing a case where numerous employees failed a polygraph test, only to come out later through an independent study that they were all telling the truth all along. The New Yorker also discussed how it's actually fairly easy to train to beat a polygraph test by hiding your psychological emotions, or better yet, your physiological responses to those psychological emotions. Ultimately, while a polygraph test isn't a fraud, it definitely isn't perfect either. In conclusion, polygraphs were first emerged from the concept of psychological responses correlating with measurable physiological responses. This created the polygraph test as we know it today, where multiple bodily metrics are measured in order to determine whether or not there may be a spike. However, this isn't fully accurate, and a lot of reputable sources have analyzed whether or not this can be fully accurate, which is why most courts and legal proceedings don't use it as a single-handed determinant. Overall, polygraph tests are a useful tool, but only in supplement with other materials that can determine whether or not someone is actually telling the truth. After all, they may be called lie detectors, but they can't actually detect lies. Thank you.